Welcome, welcome to people as you join us. We're just gathering people up and we'll make a start when we have a number of people here. So warm welcome to a Tōnest webinar this morning. Kia ora. Looking forward to learning some more treaty and its application in our work. It's always great to apply theory to practice, and so looking forward to hearing from Tarapuhi this morning. Welcome to all as you join us. Welcome to all the new people as you come along, and as is suggested here, it's great if people pop into the chat who you are and where you're from, so do feel free to pop your name in there as you arrive. That'll be great, so we'll know who's here to join with us today. Welcome, welcome to all the people just joining us today. Please come on in and pop your name and where you're from in the chat box, and then we'll have a bit of a picture building for each other of who's here. Just to let you know, this session is being recorded for those who are wondering, so that there will be the opportunity to listen later. So just to let you know, it's being recorded. Your faces won't be recorded, just the session and the notes. So please have your mics off, but you won't need your cameras on. Welcome, welcome. So just to let you know, the chat's disabled. Geneva, I'm not sure if you're able to make a change on that, but I've just had a few messages there to say that the chat's disabled. All right, well, while we sort that out, please pop your names in the chat once it becomes enabled. If that doesn't happen, feel free to use the Q&A box to do your interactions with one another. Not sure why it's disabled, we'll try and fix that. A warm, warm welcome here this morning. I'm excited to introduce Tarapuhi Vaeau to us today, who's going to share her learning, her information, her mātauranga on treaty and application into the sexual violence sector. So I think we'll make a start, and so we don't lose any time and opportunity to hear from Tarapuhi. So I'm going to open us up this morning. Ko mege tai rākana hau, no otautahi au. I'm from the Tauiwi Caucus of Tōnest, and I welcome you all here today. So we'll start with our karakia. Toko te wairoa ki rere ki ngā taumata hei arahi i ngā tikanga a rātou mā, kia mau, kia ita, kia kori ai I ngaro, kia pupuri, kia whakamaua, kia tina, tina, hui e, tāhiki e. So it's with great delight that we have a new session on the treaty with a new speaker for us, Tarapuhi, and we look forward, and you'll do a wider introduction about yourself when you begin, and we look forward to hearing all your questions, and pop those in the Q&A, and we'll have time at the end to field those with Tarapuhi. But I'm going to hand over now to her. She's the person you've come to listen to, and warmly welcome you.
Kia ora, thank you. Tēnā tātou katoa. It's so nice to see some familiar names in the participants list. Ko Tarapuhi Vaeau tōku ingoa. He uri no Te Ati Haunui-a-Papārangi no Ngāti Raukawa ki Te Tonga. I'm a māmā to Hawaii, who some of you know. He's 2. And I also am a caregiver to my little brother and sister, Ocean and Liam. And my mahi world focuses on research and design, specifically about historical trauma and healing. And that focus comes from a kind of deep whānau wide desire to for us to unlock our potential through healing. And so especially a lot of my generation and my whānau and the generation before us have kind of been working really hard in our professional and our whānau world to address our own experiences of historical and intergenerational trauma. The background to the presentation that I'm sharing with you today draws on my background in research, and you'll see that it's like a little bit nerdy, but that's how I like things. So I'm going to share with you a lot of evidence from Māori research, and it is going to think about Te Tiriti or Waitangi theoretically, but also give you some practical ways that you can implement Te Tiriti or Waitangi. And I hope that by the end of this, you will see Te Tiriti or Waitangi as a framework for opening up our understanding of sexual violence and healing and change, rather than it feeling like something historical or something that is big and scary. And the other thing I just wanted to point out is that this presentation, how I created it, was really aimed at Tauiwi, Pākehā and Aotearoa. So it's not necessarily aimed towards those of you who I know have a lot of expertise with Te Tiriti or Waitangi. But hopefully maybe I can share some interesting insights that might be new to you. So I kind of want to cover three things. The first is like a really basic overview of Te Tiriti or Waitangi. I'm going to share with you one of my favorite resources. And then I thought we could just explore, how does Te Tiriti or Waitangi open up our understanding of sexual violence and healing? And I like this question because it sees Te Tiriti as a framework for liberation for everyone. And then finally, looking specifically at how the sexual violence sector might better action Te Tiriti or Waitangi. And so this comes from a lot of research, but also another focus for my mahi is design. And to me, design is those moments where we are seeking change, putting things together to plan for or to map out change that needs to happen. And so I speak specifically to those moments of design, which I'm sure a lot of you are engaged in design, even if you don't use that language. But any moments where we're imagining new futures and we're putting things in place to get there. And I imagine that you all know that this touches on ideas of sexual violence, but I also just wanted to remind that there'll be content relating to colonial violence. And so to just take care of yourself, especially if you have whakapapa to people who have experienced colonial violence. Take care of yourself while we're listening and after, and let me know if there's anything I can do to support that. So I'm just going to check and make sure. Has anyone got any needs or questions before I start? No, yeah. Yes, the training will be, it's being recorded, eh?
Yes, it's being recorded, and just to let you know, the chat box is now sorted and people are popping in lots of names in there, which is wonderful to see the breadth of attendees here today. But there's nothing that I can see at this stage that's a concern, Tarapuhi, so all good.
Kapai, okay. So let's get into it. So before we really get into it, I just wanted to invite you to take a little bit of time to pause and to get ready for the listening to the knowledge that I'm going to share. And a lot of this is not my knowledge. but it is knowledge that I've collected together that I think will be useful for you. And it was all based off the work of Māori experts and Black and Indigenous experts more broadly in places like the university, but also in other kind of knowledge production spaces. And so I want you to consider partaking in a little bit of observational research for yourself. I'm trained in anthropology, so this is like where my nerdy part comes into. And to use your body and your emotions as kind of like an instrument to collect data. So to kind of consider and notice and reflect on the following things. How does my body react to the different pieces of knowledge shared? And just to notice if there's feelings of guilt or defensiveness and openness, not necessarily to do anything with what you notice, but just to notice. And then to think about what it might tell you about how you've been socialized to interpret this knowledge. To consider when you make immediate assumptions about what applies to you or your organization and what doesn't. When we assume that we're already practicing something successfully, you know, we might have moments of being like, oh yeah, I know I already nailed that, or not. And when do I assume that a claim or a piece of evidence is strong, is robust, irrelevant, or over the top? And I don't bring this up to say that you're definitely going to have these feelings or assumptions, but the work of understanding Te Tiriti and of working together across difference involves coming into contact with knowledge and worldviews that are different to us. And being culturally competent and ethical requires us understanding those boundaries. And our body and our mind can tell us often when we're coming up against those different worldviews. And ideally, we can challenge ourselves and be more open to change by noticing and thinking about how our worldview may be limiting our ideas. So it's not a test, but just an invitation. It can be really interesting. So I know that everyone will probably be at different stages in understanding Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And whenever I talk about Te Tiriti o Waitangi, first ask people to think about if they have read it. And it is surprising how many people have not actually read it. And I remember even a few years ago at Waitangi when Jacinda Ardern was asked to recite the articles of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And I think it's not a bad thing that we can't all recite it, but I do think it does prevent us from actually being really effective in implementing it. And so one of my favorite resources is from the Treaty Resource Centre, and it is Te Tiriti o Waitangi in plain English. So the first thing is that we're just going straight to Te Tiriti o Waitangi, which is the treaty that most of the chiefs who signed the treaty signed it. And it is translated from Te Reo Māori into English. So we start by accepting that Te Tiriti o Waitangi is the kind of founding document. And then this really eloquently summarizes it in a way that is really simple. So I'm just going to read through it for you. So the first is the introduction. And the introduction says that the Queen wants Māori people to keep their lands and independence, and she wants all peoples to live together in peace. This agreement is to make a government for her people who are now in New Zealand and for those who will come in the future. A couple of things that stick out to me in that is that a desire for Māori to keep their lands and for all people to live together in peace. And also that the agreement is for there to be a government for her people who are now in New Zealand and those who will come. The first article is that Māori give to the Queen of England the right to have a governor in New Zealand. And a governor is really significant because a governor, the chiefs especially knew the role of a governor at the time, and many of the chiefs who signed had knowledge about how those operated. Some even travelled to Australia or to the UK to see that a governor was a single person who had some authority over the people that were there. And that's quite a difference to thinking that that the treaty guaranteed or gave sovereignty over. When you think about a governor as a singular person, I think it really helps us understand what the people who signed Te Tiriti Waitangi were imagining. The second article, the Queen agrees that Māori keep their independence and keep control over their lands and everything that is important to them. They give to the Queen the right to buy land if they want to sell it. Some really important parts there is that the guarantee that Māori keep our independence and control over our lands and everything that is important to us. Okay, so the third article is that the Queen gives Māori people the same rights as British citizens. Nice and simple. And the fourth, which is a spoken promise, is that the governor promises to protect Māori customs and the different religions in New Zealand. So I don't know about you, but I think this is such a powerful way to see Te Tiriti Waitangi in this kind of plain English. And I like how it recognizes the simplicity of the agreement, but it also feels really hopeful and you can see the values behind it. And I think it really powerfully paints a picture of what those who signed Te Tiriti Waitangi were signing up to, which wasn't complete giving over of sovereignty. And there was an essence of an agreement and a shared desire to protect and to create a place of peace for everyone, but specifically for Māori to still have control and access to our livelihoods, our ways of being, our whenua, at the core of Te Tiriti Waitangi. So when we think about recognising or actioning Te Tiriti Waitangi, it is about those specific articles that I just went through. And then sometimes we talk about the principles of Te Tiriti Waitangi, which are also useful. But we also need to think about addressing the historical, contemporary and future breaches of Te Tiriti Waitangi. So it is about that document that was signed, but it is also about what happened after. We cannot action Te Tiriti Waitangi just by taking the document and applying it now. We need to consider everything that's happened afterwards and recognizing that addressing the breaches of Te Tiriti Waitangi is just as important. And I put in there, see Waitangi Tribunal and Māori Leadership and Research, because the great thing about that is there's so much knowledge and guidance about how to do that. And the Waitangi Tribunal, not just the actual tribunal, but all of the work that goes into submitting to the tribunal has masses and masses of knowledge that help us understand so many things about how we can action Te Tiriti Waitangi, specific to things like violence, but also more broadly about service provision. So I encourage you to think about how applying Te Tiriti isn't just about applying those articles, but also the knowledge that has been generated afterwards. And I think one thing that I wanted to speak to just before we go into some more detail is one thing that I think is really powerful about seeing Te Tiriti o Waitangi like this is that it shifts our understanding as from Te Tiriti as an agreement between chiefs and the Crown to recognising that it's also about the well-being of everybody in Aotearoa. And you can see in here that we're considering not just the Crown and Māori, not just Pākehā and Māori, but it is about everyone who's in Aotearoa. And I encourage you to think about how sometimes we limit our understanding of Te Tiriti and don't recognise the implications for things like migration and for Tauiwi who are not Māori, who are not Pākehā. And that Te Tiriti is the document or a kind of founding framework for understanding our relationship with each other as tangata whenua and the Crown and Pākehā, but also other Tauiwi. And I think it's key for us to recognise that it's not just about how the Crown views non-Pākehā Tauiwi, but also how Māori view. So for example, recognising that there is a special relationship between tangata whenua in Aotearoa and tangata o te moana or Pacifica people, and that that we as tangata whenua have special obligations to our whanaunga, our whānau who are from the Pacific, that are important to us, that are taonga to us, that go beyond the Crown's understanding of borders and of relationships with states. So I encourage you to think about not just how the Crown thinks about things like all of the people who are in Aotearoa and who will come in the future, but that Māori also have a right to understand and address those kinds of things. I also just wanted to really recognise that there are, alongside the knowledge that I've highlighted here, well, part of this knowledge is there's often really specific work done to understand the implications for the sexual violence sector, and that you have a strong kind of framework that speaks to the articles of Te Tiriti and speaks to specific ways that this should shape your understanding of your mahi. And I think one thing I wanted to call out was how this is framed. So Te Aorere Kura draws on Te Tiriti o Waitangi, Mātauranga Māori and Te Ao Māori values to envision a different expectation of how to achieve safety and well-being for all people in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I think a really key part of that is to recognise that when we're talking about Te Tiriti o Waitangi, it is not just about Māori spaces. It's not just something, it's not a Māori thing, it's an all of us thing. And we can use that to, often that's interpreted as limiting, but actually I think in this framework, it shows how actually it opens up our understanding and options for addressing issues like sexual violence. And you can see at the bottom there, our Māori focus seeks to be inclusive of all perspectives. Māori and Pacific people share a special relationship o wā. They're connected by whakapapa with kinship through commonalities of history, culture, and traditions of origin. They call out wairuatanga, which is roughly translated to spirituality, and I'll draw on that a little bit. And customs formed by Te Ao Māori and enacted through tikanga. So I think I just wanted to encourage you to reflect on this and reflect on other kind of really specific pieces of knowledge that have been created to help craft an understanding of Te Tiriti o Waitangi and sexual violence and healing. And to remember that this is about all of us together as Aotearoa, New Zealand. It is not a specific Māori thing, and it's not just about Māori in the Crown or iwi in the Crown. It's about all of us as people living on this whenua. So I wanted to call out some insights, and this is another really awesome resource. It's really practical. Te Tiriti or Waitangi-based practice in health promotion. And I think it's really relevant even to people who aren't working specifically in the medical system, because it relies on a definition of health that is about hauora and well-being. And that is, in one perspective, what you do and what we're all seeking to achieve. And one thing that is quoted is that ethical practice in a New Zealand context requires prioritising work that improves Māori health. And I think this challenges us to step past seeing Te Tiriti or Waitangi as kind of an abstract strategy and recognise that ethical practice requires engaging with Te Tiriti and requires prioritising work that improves Māori health. And I think an assumption that could be taken from this quote is that improving Māori health limits who can access these societal improvements. But as we'll talk about, actually, this framing helps us to see that prioritising work that improves Māori health actually allows us to address root causes of the issues that we all care about. Another quote, the treaty recognises Māori tino rangatiratanga or sovereignty and guarantee to tangata whenua the same rights as British citizens. The government in its role as Crown and the treaty has a responsibility to ensure that Māori are not persistently exposed to higher risks than the rest of the population, and that research approaches counter rather than exacerbate existing inequalities between Māori and non-Māori. And I think this really calls us into recognising that our role in applying Te Tiriti is not just about those moments where we're directly engaging with Māori, but that we have a more implicit obligation to reduce risk and to reduce the risk that Māori experience and to address existing inequalities. This is from that first resource, and it recognises that institutionalised racism and culturally unsafe practices are still the normal way to do things. Institutional racism is entrenched in the government's kāwanatanga of the public sector. One of the reasons I wanted to call this out is because we really need to start from a place of recognising this and accepting and embracing it, that even as we try to work within these systems, it is inevitable that we will be contributing to institutionalised racism. And we need to work on how we can counter that as much as possible. But we cannot do that if we don't start from the point of recognising that institutionalised racism is entrenched. Another point that I thought was interesting to this context was that a prerequisite to a functional tiriti relationship is to first do no harm. And that this resource calls non-Māori in to engage in self-reflection, decolonisation education, and to strengthen political and cultural competencies to be an effective partner. And I wanted to call out that they speak to strengthening both cultural and political competencies. And as I'm sure you're all aware, the political is personal and that's most dark in spaces that you work in, and the issues that you are trying to address. But to be able to really efficiently and effectively engage with Te Tiriti requires an understanding of the political and cultural landscape that we exist in. And it also calls us in as people, as individuals, to do this work, that we can't just operate as a representation of our organisations, but that this thinking needs to be deeply personal as well. So this quote I chose because it highlights a responsibility to system and structural change. It says, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, a focus on dealing successfully with adversity rather than addressing the conditions that perpetuate inequitable adversity is contrary to the rights underpinned by the Treaty of Waitangi. So this kind of recognises that not dealing with the systemic root cause of issues is contrary to the right of the treaty, underpinned by the Treaty of Waitangi. And it provides kind of a mandate for us to look to these systemic, institutionalized, entrenched causes of inequality. Kia ora, I'm just checking in with the chat. I see that Polly has said, I'm sure we have practitioners have an in-depth understanding of Te Tiriti, which I totally agree. Many, as I said at the start, many of you may have already have a deep understanding of this. I just wanted to start with going back over it, because I think, especially when I talk to the organisers, we kind of have a diversity of understanding. So that's no way to put down that many of you have a lot of knowledge and practice in applying this, but just for people who this might be new to, we just wanted to kind of go over it.
And we appreciate that, Tarapuhi. It's true that there is a mixture of understanding, not just in our sector, but across this land. And so it's good to get the basics clear. So appreciate you doing that.
So this is one of my favorite quotes, especially when thinking about design. System of oppression, inequality, inequity are by design. Therefore, they can be redesigned. And if we think about the evidence that I shared in the previous section and how that kind of provides a mandate or a responsibility to look to system change and to look to the root causes of violence and healing, I think this quote can help us see the hope in that, and also kind of illuminate pathways for change. And so I just wanted to bring in some insights from the literature that I've explored about how we might see a Te Tiriti informed understanding of sexual violence and healing. And these range from kind of more theoretical or strategic ideas all the way to kind of practical implementation and personal implementation. And this is not a comprehensive discussion. It is just an overview of some of the things that are interesting. So one of them is that Māori are diverse and exist in all spaces and are shaped by all structures in Aotearoa. So often when we think about Te Tiriti, we think about applying it in kura kaupapa and marae, but we need to recognise that Māori exist in all spaces, that Māori exist in all whānau in Aotearoa. So Pacific spaces, migrant spaces, refugee background spaces, mainstream spaces. Māori exist in all of those spaces. And so we need to consider all of those spaces need to be safe for Māori. A really key idea is that colonialism and white supremacy can be seen as the foundation for sexual violence and healing in Aotearoa for everyone. And that involves looking specifically at the ways in which colonialism and white supremacy relate to things like our ideas of violence, its connection to sexism and sexual violence and gender-based violence. But the research overwhelmingly demonstrates that these forces are the structures that fuel and enable sexual violence for all of us in Aotearoa, not just for Māori. Māori are affected by everybody who live in Aotearoa, but that it is a connecting force that we together should look to changing. Another idea is of historical and intergenerational trauma and healing. And this recognizes that we need to look to both collective and structural and personal healing. So this means that we cannot deal with the issue and we cannot conceptualize the issue as just being an interpersonal one, but that we also need to tend to collective healing and tend to both historical and intergenerational trauma. Another key idea is to look at intersectional identities, sex and sexuality as taonga. So when we think back to the articles, we see in a few places how wairuatanga, how Māori concepts and ideas are guaranteed by Te Tiriti. And that means that means treasuring and responding to Māori ideas of sexual violence, sexual healing, and more broadly of sex and sexuality, and seeing those as taonga and encouraging us to see, to shift towards a culture together that recognises this mātauranga. Another interesting point is to see body sovereignty as a foundational framework. And we can see specifically the language of sovereignty in Te Tiriti or Waitangi of the discourse around it. But body sovereignty is being used by Indigenous scholars to understand both experiences of sexual violence and prevention. I think that you will all kind of recognize that mātauranga Māori is a key and should be the foundational aspect for transforming Māori experiences. But I wanted to bring this quote because I think sometimes we don't recognize the diversity of mātauranga, and that when we centre Māori, we need to think about the diversity of Māori, including Māori who have a limited association with Māori society, but are primarily integrated into mainstream New Zealand, and Māori who are isolated from both Māori and mainstream society, as well as those who are strongly linked with their traditional networks. There's a lot of amazing mahi done to explore specific definitions of sexual violence in Aotearoa. And I think they all start by recognising that the current definitions are located within dominant Pākehā frameworks, and that these do not provide adequately for context. And that's kind of recentish work. Just going to skip through some of these. I think this is a really key idea, and one that can be a bit of a jump. But I think this is perhaps the most important change that needs to happen, is recognizing that colonial ideologies, practices of gender, race, and class have been imported here, and they work to both undermine Māori structures, but also that they work to create the conditions for sexual violence for everybody. So a point that I just thought that could be interesting to think about was we saw in Te Tiriti o Waitangi that there's a guarantee for the protection of wairuatanga, but I also encourage you to consider how your understanding of spirituality or wairuatanga might be shaped by your cultural identity. So for example, there's a quote at the bottom here that speaks to the way that takatapuitanga, which is about the kind of diverse genders and sexuality and sex characteristics of Māori, is part of wairuatanga and a part of an expression of whakapapa. So with that in mind, we can see, or we could imagine how Te Tiriti o Waitangi provides protection and a framework for understanding the diversity of sexual identity, gender identity, and sex characteristics, because it is framed and is experienced as an expression of wairuatanga. Talked a bit about the structures and how Te Tiriti provides a mandate for structural change. I'm just gonna go to part 3 here and just speak specifically to design and just some recognition here that I guess the practice that we're trying to support in reflecting on Te Tiriti o Waitangi is to create a collective understanding of change and be more in tune with each other, and using Te Tiriti o Waitangi as a guide. And that starts by recognizing that the traditional methods we use to design and create, the way we're doing it currently, is actually reinforcing the systems that we're trying to prevent or trying to change. And so one of the kind of suggestions that's made in the literature is to think about intersectionality and to apply the theory of intersectionality, which I'll speak to, as a foundation for understanding the change that needs to be made to truly address white supremacy and colonialism. And this quote, I'll just read the bottom here. Working towards a future without sexual violence means that advocates, survivors, and communities need to respond to a complex and layered reality that centers the needs of those survivors most marginalized, silenced, and unseen. And that last part of the sentence is the point I really want to highlight here, is that an intersectional approach, and I'm arguing a Te Tiriti-centered approach, centers the needs of the survivors who are the most marginalized, silenced, and unseen. And doing this requires understanding that we cannot continue to consider one singular identity and one singular form of marginalization, and recognize that when forms of discrimination intersect, not only do the people at that intersection experience the full weight of the marginalization, but they compound and create an experience which is larger than the sum of the parts. And so much of the literature kind of states that without an explicit intersectional approach, equality and anti-discrimination policies will tend to reproduce the discrimination patterns they seek to address, including in all areas of society, including in the fields that many of you work in, which is specifically anti-discrimination and social justice. And so what this asks of us is an intersectional approach considers and takes really seriously the ways that racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia are all connected and part of the system that we need to address to change sexual violence. And that when we separate them out, we're doing a disservice to the kaupapa. And an intersectional approach, and perhaps a Te Tiriti approach, might include focusing on those who sit at the intersections of overlapping systems of discrimination. So focusing and centering those who are multiply marginalized. And that maybe we might speak about that as a recognition of the voice of those who are most directly impacted, and really valuing this voice or lifting it up, which here speaks to promoting and supporting the leadership and storytelling of those most affected by policies and practices, centering their substantive suggestions and values into any given project or advocacy. And I think what I want you to take away from this discussion of intersectionality and Te Tiriti is to recognize that the multiply marginalized and the most impacted communities have kind of a special knowledge from their direct experience that makes them important thought leaders in the change, and that valuing this voice takes work and requires action. And we can see when we're not being intersectional, when these voices aren't at the front or at the center. So kind of wrapping up what that would look like. And this isn't to say this is where everybody in this room exists, but more of a reflection of where the system is at based on the evidence, and where the multiply marginalized identify change should happen. So that involves going from sexual violence and healing as often being individualized, placing the responsibility on the individual rather than the collective, towards having a shared, detailed and specific understanding of white supremacy and colonialism as the foundation for sexual violence and healing. It means going from recognizing cultural and social influences of sexual violence and healing in a way where we focus on a part of the system, for example, just sexism, towards understanding system change through an intersectional lens. It involves going from seeing the role of white supremacy, colonialism, and slavery in sexual violence in a way that's often ignored or misunderstood, towards decolonizing becoming a central focus of the sexual violence sector. And importantly, it goes from Māori experiences of sexual violence and healing being seen as separate or not connected, to Māori thought leadership being valued as key to our collective liberation from sexual violence. And Tauiwi embracing the responsibility to address the racist roots of sexual violence in Aotearoa. I had some kind of reflective questions that you might want to think about, and I encourage you to think about the ideas that I invited you to reflect on at the start. The first is to consider how your personal idea of justice and healing, or our kind of desired future in Aotearoa, might change or be solidified or not change if there was true recognition that Māori did not cede sovereignty. And to think about it not just as somebody who might represent the Crown or work in an organisation, but to think about it from your unique position. So if you are Samoan, for example, to think about what would your experience of Aotearoa be if we recognise that Māori did not cede sovereignty? How does that change your idea of responsibility, of the change we want to see and what is possible? And then the second reflection is, how might your understanding of sexual violence in Aotearoa change if it recognised the evidence from Māori scholars, researchers and communities that colonialism and white supremacy are the roots of the systems of violence we're trying to resist in this work? And that means truly seeing it as the cause of sexual violence and the opportunity for healing for everybody. And recognising that white supremacy is a part of our culture in Aotearoa. And then I just wanted to leave on this quote, which is Sir Mason Jury, which is that good health and good health practice come from a shared interest in the justness of society. Perhaps more than anything else, it is the hope and promise such justness that Te Tiriti most enshrines. And that's just to encourage us to see Te Tiriti as this kind of founding framework that is really hopeful, and that if we embrace it, can actually be a pathway for shared and collective change. That's me, Maggie.
Karawi, somebody's written, and I agree. What a lot of content in there, Tarapuhi, and I really want to get the slides later so I can go back over your quotes, which I was furtively writing down, but missed a few. I noticed there's some lovely help going on in the chat with people who'd missed somebody's name in a quote there and got it to each other. I'm just going to check in with Geneva as to whether we've got questions that have come through. I'm seeing mostly in my Q&A box that people couldn't get on the chat, seem to be the main thrust.
There currently is no other questions, but if anybody has questions that they would like to ask Tarapuhi, please feel free to put it into the question and answer box now, and we'll use the last 8 minutes of this presentation to answer that.
So there's been a couple of questions that have come through. One in particular, I noticed there that there was a request for this to be expounded a little more in our conference in November. And I just need to say that that's possibly not going to happen, mostly because to our delight, but also our dismay, we have so many people that wanted to do sessions at our conference that they've long since booked out, which is difficult, and there's been lots of disappointed people who haven't been able to present. So just to let you know that that may not be possible this time, but it does not mean that we can't come back to this topic again and have some more in depth. So appreciating that question and that prompt for us to explore more deeply. So I'm just trying to check and see if there's more. I'm not seeing other questions in the chat box, but I realise that Tarapuhi, in some ways you moved over some of your slides a little more quickly, and there's some lovely feedback there about you being awesome, which is great, and I support that. So people wanting an email of the presentation, but it's being recorded, so I'm not quite sure if you're wanting to email out your slides as well.
I'm happy to email out my slides.
Happy to do that?
Yeah.
So what we'll do is get a hold of those Geneva who you're all booked in with. We'll be able to distribute that information to those who registered. So that will be the opportunity. Otherwise, I see Tarapuhi has put her email address in there. Feel free to take those down while the slide is up. Were there parts about your presentation, given we left good time for questions and there aren't a lot of questions, I'm wondering if there's things that you would like to go back into a little more depth, that you moved over a bit more quickly, being conscious of time.
That is a good idea. Let me see. So one of the ideas that I didn't go into detail, which I think is really interesting and could be a really powerful framework for kind of collective understandings of prevention, because it kind of draws on ideas of consent and healing, but through language that is really specific to the Indigenous experience. And that is body sovereignty. And there's some really amazing Māori researchers and thinkers who work in this space. And it's specifically, this is a quote from Ashley Gillen's work. And what I like about her work is she specifically looks at the role or the intersection between fatness and experiences of the body and body sovereignty. And in the presentation, I encouraged or kind of put forth that an intersectional approach helps us to implement Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And this is one way that we can understand that by looking at the way that fat phobia is linked to white supremacy and is a part of the system of sexual violence. And they offer kind of a framework for understanding how we can move past it. And so one of the quotes from her work is, body sovereignty is inherently political and centers informed consent and agency, and therefore requires an element of critically, particularly in relation to our personal practice as individuals and how we perpetuate or do not perpetuate systems of oppression, as seen within some body positivity movements. And then she talks to how body sovereignty at an individual level centers on access to decision-making processes around our bodies, as well as access to resources in ways that acknowledge our kaitiakitanga and rangatiratanga. And I think that last point about access to decision-making processes is really key for thinking about work where we're creating policies or programs. And it recognizes that even processes of design or co-design or research can enable those broader practices of violence towards especially Māori, and that we need to think carefully about our processes and how they can either create opportunities for healing between structures, so between Māori and the Crown, or they can create more opportunities for further entrenching that structural violence. So I like the way that this framework of body sovereignty offers opportunity for thinking about collective violence and healing, as well as personal violence and healing.
So much depth in there.
Yeah.
And I think that in particular, I'm thinking that quite often as Pākehā in particular, we come to this conversation wanting, where's the handbook? Where's the book of rules?
Yeah.
What steps do we follow? And if I get a this and I get a that and I get a kaumātua and I do, you know, have three kind of these boxes ticked, well, then I'm being culturally responsive and appropriate. And it's so much more what is our thinking, what is our construction, what is our internal process.
Yeah.
And it's harder to see and address, and it's a life journey in my experience.
It is harder. And I think that it's important for, well, I think what is powerful about these frameworks is that it gives us a pathway. Yeah. And if we are to recognize white supremacy and colonialism as part of our culture and as something that shapes our world, there's actually really practical steps that we can take, like learning about white supremacy culture, learning about the specific ways that it operates. And there's a great resource called White Supremacy Culture that I suggest everyone look at, and kind of embracing the discomfort about recognizing white supremacy, but that once we start exploring that, then we can truly engage in things like sharing culture through things like pōhiri and te reo Māori. But until we really think about how we're cultured now, we can't do that safely. Yeah, so I encourage people to start there, even if you aren't white or Pākehā, starting by exploring the real details of colonialism and white supremacy is the most powerful place to start.
And I think you know, it illuminates for me the point that the fish doesn't know the water they're swimming in the bowl.
Yeah,
and so, you know, we can't see our fish bowl.
that's right.
Until sometimes we're drawn out of it. So that is our lifelong challenge, I think. Somebody has just asked for the name of the last quote because they missed it. So I'm just wondering, perhaps that will show up in the slides anyway, so you'll get it at a later stage. Lots of wonderful positive feedback there. Somebody saying that's my māmā.
Mhm.
So obviously your tamariki is there. We're going to need to move to closing, which sadly we've run out of time, but what an interesting conversation. Love to return to it a little more fully another time. And thank you once again on behalf of Tōnis for giving us your time. It's been a treasure. So I'll just wrap us up with a karakia whakamutu now. Kia whakairea te tapu, kia wātia ai te ara, kia tūroku whakataha ai, kia tūroku whakataha ai. Haumi e, hui e, tahi ki e. Thanks everybody, lovely to have you. And thank you, Tarapuhi. Lots of positive comments in there. Thanks so much, Tarapuhi. That's been that's very fascinating. I need to get your notes so that I can drill down into some of those quotes. What a lovely collection of quotes.
Yes, it can be a bit intense, but I think often it can help. You can't remember everything from a session, so it can help people to really go deeper later on if they wish to.
Yeah, and I can see that there's an appetite for perhaps another deepening after this, you know, to come back to this conversation. But yeah, that's cool. So I don't know, Geneva, whether you want to take us into another space. Will we close this off for now?
Yes, I will end the webinar now. Thank you, everybody.
Wonderful.